Hello, and welcome to Operating the Sidewalk and Curb of the Future webinar presented today by Harmonize Mobility. We certainly hope that you and everyone that you care about remains safe and healthy during this global crisis. My name is Jerry Boyer, one of the founders of Harmonize Mobility. We are a Canadian firm focused on the workability of deploying new mobility technologies. Our work includes systems to connect and integrate ride-hailing and public transit. We also offer courses and workshops to help rationalize planning responses to the uncertainty in rapidly changing technologies and demands. And today's critical topic, the real-time coordination of for-hire vehicles for passengers, goods delivery vehicles, and later automated vehicles as they load and unload passengers and goods at our curbs and on our sidewalks. I'm going to leave everyone on mute for the first 30 minutes during the presentation. Following the presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Just a little bit about the process. To ask a question, you can type a question into the question drop down on the control panel. You can also raise a hand and I will call on you to ask the question. I'll handle the mute and unmute process, and we'll do our best to get to all your questions. But now I want to introduce our co-founder, Bern Grush, to talk about a new project under the support and approval of the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. The project is designed to standardize real-time operations at the curbside and sidewalk for now and into the future. Bern is a 35-year veteran of the standards making process, most recently working on 2 ISO standards related to electronic toll collection for road pricing. Bern, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank all of you for taking time away from your activities and your families, and for your interest in addressing the current and coming issues surrounding the deployment of our sidewalks and curbs. To add to what Jerry said, I hope all of you are safe and able to stay healthy in these circumstances. I know we all share the alarm and concern that our current situation represents. It is now becoming widely recognized that many of the expectations or hopes we had regarding technologies, transit, planning, and automation are now in flux. What was already uncertain in regards to transit and transportation in all of its modes and formats has now become even more uncertain. The same is true in regards to budgets and funding for many of the programs we had been envisioning until now. One thing that is most likely to remain a focus of concern, regardless of all of these changes, is our curb and sidewalk spaces, how we use them, optimize them, enjoy them, and monetize them, how we keep them safe, groomed, and livable. As this current crisis morphs into a recovery and reconfiguration of how we do some, or perhaps many things, the overall intensities of parking, ride-hailing, transit ridership, active transportation, e-commerce deliveries, microtransit, and micromobility will likely differ from what they were before this pandemic. But what is clear is that the sidewalk and curb will continue to grow in critical importance for space, access, competition, business, and hopefully urban enjoyment. We have largely focused our attention over the past century on the roadway. We have done this for reasons of moving people and freight in motorized vehicles, and we have largely focused on the tension between speed and safety, trying to optimize each, usually to the detriment of the other. Relatively speaking, we have neglected the curb until recently. There has long been a struggle over how to park our overabundant vehicles that are idle more often than not. And at the turn of the millennium, we have begun to express more focused concerns for proper management of parking, usually around pricing matters. Biking demand started to grow in many places, ride-hailing, e-commerce, all things demanding a bit more of the curb, and in the case of scooters and other micromobility devices, now beginning to spill onto our sidewalks. It is projected that we can expect driverless taxis to drop passengers at the curb, that delivery bots will be able to cover the last 100 meters across intersections and along sidewalks, dodging people in wheelchairs, pets and skateboarders and garbage cans. One interesting potential is the notion of a large goods delivery vehicle parking near a number of delivery locations and proceeding to release a small number of sidewalk drones to operate within a modest radius. Some of these automation ideas are still a few years away, but we clearly already have an overconstrained curb with a growing variety and intensity of modes. There is no need to wait for automation for us to begin managing the curb as a collaborative logistics space. We need to incorporate into a single real-time logistics model the dynamics of parking, passenger loading, transit, express delivery, biking, and other modes. That is the purpose of the work we are inviting you to engage in with us. How we handle the curb today has already begun to change. For the purposes of this talk, we distinguish three key elements of this activity. On the left, mapping the physical inventory of the curb, sometimes called coding the curb. This is done by a number of service firms already today. The activity of managing the curb, more of a governance activity, includes bylaws and usage rights, pricing schedules and fees, enforcement guidelines, court services, and so on. Then there's the actual real-time operation of the curb. Today, that means given the understanding of what is where and the management rules set by city council or traffic parking or traffic and parking and transit planners, how are things handled right now at 2:10 p.m. today? That today is guided by signage, prices in some cases, and often enforced by parking or police officers, and sadly, sometimes in court. One key issue today is that these operations are fragmented, inefficient, and differ from location to location. The question that we're posing now is, how will operations be handled in the future as the intensity of ride-hailing and e-commerce increases, and as automation joins the competition for access to the curb? We, and others, propose that vehicle connectivity and urban networks and machine intelligence will handle this, hopefully smoothly. What our work is about is establishing a standard for the data, communications, and protocols for systems to operate this new curb and its related enforcement and monetization. Note that the standard we are describing would not set policy, numbers, prices, or schedules. Rather, it sets out the language and protocols to set all of those things for mixed, automated, and non-automated real-time environments. Much and eventually all of this operation will be in the cloud, automated and with human oversight. Much of it likely remote and dynamic, all of it in near real time, similar to air traffic control. As time goes on, how the curb is currently operated will change completely. But this change will be gradual and needs this standard to guide that change. There are a lot of new scenarios to consider in the matter of real-time operation. These contemplate automation, but some apply to ride-hailing and goods delivery today. What happens when there are more vehicles than spaces? Should they circle the block? Should they park in the bike lane? Should they stop inside the transit stop? It gets more interesting with sidewalk delivery drones. Will there be numeric limits for these devices placed per block? Perhaps 0 in some cases. As the real-time problem grows and we use more connectivity, we need broader, shared standards that interoperate among ride-hailing, logistics, transit, and automated versions of each of these. The sidewalk and curb are increasingly central to cities. There are now so many demands besides simply storing vehicles for a couple of hours that real-time management of these assets in some locations is already in failure mode. The ISO standard we have proposed and are launching has many stakeholders. Many of you on this call are stakeholders. How will this turn out over the next few years will matter to your cities, to your businesses, and to your users. Notice that we put accessibility in a central position here. Our philosophy is that if we get accessibility right from the start, then the standard will work for everyone. This would save doing things over. So there are two bodies of collaborators: stakeholders on the left, such as some of you might be, and the formal ISO technical committee and working group that ensures the correct structure, expression, research, clarity, and completeness of each ISO standard. As liaison between these two groups, our team brings all stakeholder concerns and ideas into the process. This is a valuable activity to ensure this standard is successful, both in development and deployment. Prior to being considered for any ISO standard, several things must be provided and accepted. One of these things is a draft purpose and justification statement. A link to the formal draft of this was copied to each of you in the invitation to this webinar. In review, the 5 elements of this pertain to safety, planning, commerce, operations, and liability. If you do not see that document, we can resend it to you if you ask. There will be an email address at the end. The standard is somewhat ambitious, as you will see. So we were asked to set out a specific and limited scope for part 1. 3 other parts will be described momentarily, but at this time, only part 1 is being approved and launched. We will propose subsequent parts in sequence, which I will talk about in a moment. Part 1 is focused on foundational issues, things like data dictionary, terminology, architecture, hierarchies, and metrics for the standard and for its documentation. Not mentioned here are the key issues of identifying all of the foundational standards and specifications we need to build on. We have already started this aspect of the work. I'll be talking about that in a moment as well. It is critical to base this new standard on as many existing standards and specifications as is reasonable, as is workable. There is every reason to learn from and to be consistent with things that are already working, and to be internally consistent within the new standard itself. Our first challenge is to harmonize such existing standards. We will choose a number of these as a primary foundation and then merge and build from there. One example, the Alliance for Parking Data Standards, that's APDS, is an extensive standard to share parking data across platforms. Its data definitions will be important for us. Another is kerb LR. LR stands for linear reference. This is an open standard for describing kerb regulations released less than a year ago. Kerb LR provides a shared language for streets across jurisdictions, companies, and governments. These and others need to be harmonized within a normative base before we can build definitions for real-time operations. The work plan that was submitted to the appropriate ISO technical committee, which is Technical Committee TC204, was done in October 2019 in Singapore. It shows key milestones to reach publication of Part 1 by June 2022. It's likely that COVID-19 has added a quarter to this, so assume September 2022 instead of June. Remember, there is much more to this than data definitions, standards research, and document structure. We need to detail the structure and communication protocols for operating at the curb and sidewalk, and then to integrate these. Hence, each part reaches a critical phase called committee draft ballot, which we will commence, at which point we commence the next part. You'll see this cascade in a moment. First, let's look at the other 3 parts. Part 2 applies the data, categories, architecture, and research of Part 1 for real-time curb use. Those are real-time operations at the curb. This is the system that handles reservations, priorities, queuing, bumping, queuing in motion, which is a form of holding. That's from the airline industry, and many other spatial and temporal alignments needed to manage a mixed system of human-operated and software-operated vehicles accessing the curb collaboratively, safely, and effectively. Part 3 does the same thing for sidewalks, And its part 3 is considerably harder than part 2 because it must be done in a way to integrate with part 2. And that integration is part 4, which considers the integration between sidewalk and curb. This is because that automation is expected to eventually, it might be some while, eventually take goods from a warehouse to a curb and onto the sidewalk and into a building, all with robotic controls. Consider also the case of an automated paratransit vehicle, bringing a person using an automated wheelchair to a curb and then to a sidewalk. Even the simple case of a sidewalk drone that can navigate from one sidewalk, cross an intersection, over the next curb, and onto the second sidewalk. So not only will the curb and sidewalk be the principal locus of common public attention over the next decades, but the curb and sidewalk will become one flow of data, movement, automation, and monetization. I mentioned earlier that several parts of the full project will be staggered. To be sure, each stage is thoroughly researched and prepared, and that the entire project is completed as swiftly as possible. One thing that causes standards to take a considerable time is the number of readers, commenters, approvals, and ballots. In each case, as the bulk of a part is completed and begins its reviews and ballots, the next part will commence. One of the aspects of this project is that we think it is critical to have its user community grasp the overall purpose quickly. We envision a scheme of staged levels of automation to be used as a conceptual device by planners, developers, business associations, and municipalities. It would set rough expectations before specific details are worked out. This is merely an illustration mimicking the SAE levels for vehicle automation. When improved, we think this will be an important communication tool in spite of the problems the SAE levels unleashed on the autonomous vehicle conversation. There are two benefits to sponsorship and collaboration with us on this project. If you are an operator and maker, a planner, a municipal manager, a payment operator, etc., a standard that addresses all your needs is important. It will give you a head start and an easier time to innovate. If you are a user, whether business, resident, or visitor, then optimized, safer, effective sidewalks and curbs will work better for you. If they work better, then they create easier and larger markets for the operators, makers, planners, and managers as well. It's a win-win for all stakeholders. Many people in this webinar work for or with one of the stakeholder groups I showed earlier. Of course, there are more than this, but this is representative. We think it is important that as many stakeholder facets as possible are represented. Remember that we made accessibility central to ensure cities do not spend inordinate effort repairing systems that did not properly consider accessibility at design time. We offer three things to our sponsors: quarterly written reports, which are the then current draft, and its ancillary commentary. Remember, there is much more to this. Sorry. Excuse me. The second issue, the second part of the offer is a quarterly live video meeting to review and discuss. This is important for all stakeholders to see the total landscape, including that landscape of the other stakeholders. We will caution you during this process. We caution you clearly not to introduce any commercial IP to these discussions. The standard itself will be copyrighted to ISO and will become globally available for a modest fee. But most important of all, you can propose additions and changes directly to the project leader, project editor. Each proposal will be considered, incorporated where possible, and as the formal ISO guidelines and processes permit. If you're interested to discuss this, please email and we'll set a time to talk. Thank you very much for listening. Jerry, now back over to you for the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Bern. That was very informative as always. Okay, so now I'm taking a look at, I'm just going to quickly scan over if there's any hands up, and there are no hands up right now. So I'm going to go to the questions, and nobody has asked any questions. So I think your work is easy today, Bern. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, or for those of you who are on the call that might be thinking about questions, now would be the time to either type them in or raise your hand.
While we're waiting for that, I will make a comment that these calls have been quite successful. We've been getting on the order of 100 participants each time, and the interest from both cities and planners and payment operators and those that are mapping the sidewalk and curb is certainly there. I just want to underscore what's important is that this process needs to be funded and needs to be injected with the knowledge of all of those industries. In other words, this standard can't be written without the input of all of these industries. That's pretty important to underscore. So those of you who are on the call that are stakeholders that are interested in seeing this work in the most optimal way, please reach back to us and see how we can collaborate.
That's great. Okay, so now I have one comment and some questions are coming in now, Bern. First, just one comment. The comment is, I love that accessibility is front and center. So
thank you.
So there's another question here. What about privacy?
So that's a pretty important point. So that whoever asked that question, I should put another ellipse in the stakeholders, and we should consider privacy issues. It's not something that's been listed in the outlines of the standard yet. So I apologize for not listing that. I'm very concerned about privacy, but I didn't see it as an issue in this circumstance because for the most part, we're just moving robots around for the most part. However, those robots often have a person in them, and so privacy cannot be dismissed. That has to be considered. So thank you for that question.
Great. I've got another question. Are organizations like NACTO engaged?
Oh, not yet. Can somebody make an introduction to NACTO? We'd love to have them engaged, because this is very, very much something that they would be absolutely concerned with.
Perfect. Okay, I've got another question. You state that users are interested. Does that translate into willingness to participate, particularly in standardization?
So the answer is yes. There's at least, so far, there's 4 parties that have said yes to both. And there's parties that have said yes to collaborating, but there's usually smaller, and especially accessibility partners, collaborators are relying on funding from other sources. But so the answer has been yes, and we still need more.
For sure. Okay, another question, Bern. How do you see large volume users like Amazon, etc., involved in pushing curb and sidewalk evolution?
Well, they're going to certainly make a huge demand. So that would be on this sheet. It would be I would consider them a logistics operator. What happens if there's not standards in place that a municipality can rely on? Then any operator, like a payment operator or logistics operator, can move in and make demands that the city's not sure what to do with, and then, for example, as scooters have done in some cities, and as Amazon does now with its deliveries, they just come in and do their work without any guidance. This standard sets guidance for those cities to respond to those, so that these things can be either monetized or managed or controlled in some way. And we're not saying how much they should be or what those rules should be. In other words, we're only setting out the standards and data for the operations of such guidelines, but we are not setting the numbers and so on. But at least there's a way for cities to understand and communicate these issues when dealing with those large operators. Otherwise, we'll be overwhelmed. It's a very good question.
Yeah, and there's also a follow-up comment, Bern, around privacy, and that comment is privacy may be out of scope for the standard, but it will scuttle efforts to implement the standard. So it's definitely worth kind of reopening that conversation a little bit.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'll communicate with that person more. I need to think about more. I don't want to just blurt out answers randomly. I want to think hard about that.
Yeah, fair enough.
I have been involved with the Privacy Commission in Ontario some years ago for other things, and I'm actually having the ex-commissioner of that provincial group look over the designs of several of the systems that we work on, and I can certainly have her address this as well. So I'm taking that question very seriously. I just don't want to answer it flippantly.
Great. Okay, I'm going to switch over and go to a hand up. So there's a verbal question. I've got a question. Sorry, Michael Onder. Michael Onder, your hand is up, and so I'm going to unmute you, Michael. Just give me a minute. Okay, Michael, you are unmuted. We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Thanks so much, Bert. I have my question to you. It's kind of maybe 2 or 3-parter. The word curb connotes public, and so my question has to do with any cities or municipalities that we've engaged with yet, or is that something to be done in the future?
So, Michael, I was hard for me to understand. Do you understand the question, please? Jerry?
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't understand the question. It was garbled. Did you understand the question?
It was very difficult to hear, but I did hear him asking if you are working with, or we are working with, any other cities or municipalities.
Yeah, Mike, thank you. So we're in communication with 3 different cities, and all of them are looking at it. Of course, everybody's concerned now for financial reasons and so on. So the answer is yes, and we'd love to be introduced to more. I'm not certain. I think you're in Washington, D.C., and if there's any way we can be introduced there, it'd be fabulous. But in any case, the answer is we're working very hard to get more municipal interest in this. This can't be done without logistics operators. It cannot be done without municipalities, and it cannot be done without the people building the drones, and it cannot be done without planners. It really, really needs all of these, and municipalities are absolutely critical. So thank you. And I hope I've understood your whole question.
Yeah, sorry about that, Michael. It was very difficult to understand what you were saying. Maybe if you have a follow-up question to that, you can type it in. I'm just going to go down the list. There are some more questions here, Bern. How do you see the integration of different uses of the curb space affect the design of the physical space?
Wow, there's so many good questions, and these questions underscore how complex this is. So, you might imagine that how we do parking and loading spaces now is that a loading space just assumes a longer vehicle, for example. I mean, so that's like a really simple example. So sidewalk spaces will be laid out by planners and by cities and by developers for whatever they think is best. What happens here is that space gets mapped. That's when I talked about coding the curb. That space gets mapped, and somebody in city councils decides what we're going to use that space for. We're going to park this many, and we're going to put a bike store there, and we're going to put loading there, and so on. And then what our standard allows to happen is that the assignment of those spaces, and actually the dynamic reassignment. So it's possible, for example, that one spot in certain times of the day is used for loading. Later on in the day, it's used for robotaxi drop-off. And at some other point in the day, it's actually used as a through lane. And this is very common now to have multiple dynamic uses. So those dynamic uses are coded and stored and available in the cloud for example, an automated vehicle of some kind, goods or people, to ask for and receive a spot for a certain period of time. So it's the data in the cloud that allows a real-time operation system to reassign that space, but the actual space design, how they're laid out, is it smart curbs, smart streets, complete streets? That's up to cities and planners. We do not dictate any of that. we simply take the mappings of those and allow a system to assign the use for short periods of time. I hope that's a sufficient answer to that question, but thank you for the question.
Thanks, Bern. Another question. What is the best way for large volume users to be involved? Where can they make the most impact?
Do you mean like a logistics operator that has a lot of vehicles, if that's what's meant, or a payment operator? There are several payment operators that operate in many cities with the kinds of systems that use smartphones for parking payment. Any of those large operators ought very much, really for reasons of monetization. I mean, we want logistics operators are using that kerb for business, and so any of those large operators, I invite them to be part of this, and they would be part of this by being a sponsor and meeting with us quarterly and looking at the designs and making sure that everything that they need in this imagined automated future is included, so that when they go to operate in this future kerb, they have the space and ability to operate their business. So, a company like FedEx, I picked FedEx only because they have a sidewalk drone. Not because they're on the call or anything like that, but they do have a sidewalk drone. If FedEx would like to come up to an intersection, come up to an area in the city and let out 3 or 5 or 9 sidewalk drones to run around in that short radius to deliver packages, then that company would need to reserve a spot for its van and have permission to run on those sidewalks and know that they can do that in the volumes of deliveries they'd like to do. So those operators, all of those operators, absolutely have a huge interest in this being done the right way. Otherwise, they're going to be not having the opportunities that they otherwise would have for their investments in automation. Thank you. Very important question.
Terrific. What are the, pardon me, what are the expectations and requirements for participation / sponsorship?
So there's a fee, a sponsorship fee for each of the 4 levels. And as happens to be going down from, you see it on the screen, commercial, municipal, industry association, not-for-profit. The commercial is $12,500 a year. Municipal is 8,000, I think, or 7,500. I think it's 8,000. I don't have that number in front of me. And industry association is 3,000, and not-for-profit is 1,500. That's the financial level. The input level, the actual activity of coming to quarterly meetings. So what I very much expect, and it doesn't really work for you or us if you don't involve somebody on your staff to actually read the current status, submit, you see it in yellow here, submit proposed changes and additions to make absolutely certain that your industry, I mean, you can think of your company or your city, but anyway, your industry or your sector is served by this standard. Basically, I'm working for the sponsors. I'm a volunteer to ISO. ISO just said, this is a good idea, we'll sponsor it, we'll support it, and we'll publish it. I'm saying to everybody on this call that this is your standard. I'm actually the tool that's sitting in between the ISO that's going to publish it and you that need it. And I'm getting all of my input from the existing standards. I showed that a few slides ago. There's a lot of existing standards. We are coalescing all of those into a platform that serves the needs that you need as shareholders. This is your standard. So that's very critical. Thank you.
Okay, here's another question for you, Bern. Do the actual sidewalk and curb operations require sensor integration? For example, since maps cannot provide actual sidewalk and curb real-time occupancy.
So this is an opinion. Yes. Now I want to qualify that and quantify. So that's how it is today. We don't know how much better mapping is going to get. I think there are people in mapping that are getting this pretty close, especially high definition mapping. Will that be sufficient? I don't know. Could it be? Possibly. Will we need some sensors somewhere no matter what? Yes. There are places, for example, as you may leave a street and enter a parking garage, you're going to need something about that parking garage. Certainly you do now. I've worked in that area, and that is an area that is not mappable in the external way that we usually think about mapping. So the answer is yes, right now, less and less as time goes on. The ideal is we don't need that, but I don't know if we'll ever reach that ideal of not needing any. I just want to see us need less and less. I want to also add the standard doesn't say that there has to be sensors, and here's what the sensors are. We are not saying what those are because that changes. What we are saying is, if you would like to reserve a spot, here's how you express that requirement for a reservation. If you receive a reservation, here's how we express the reservation given to you. And if you lose that reservation, here's how we negotiate with you to re-reserve for you, and so on. That is the negotiation system for all the stuff I talked about earlier. So it doesn't say anything about the sensors. It might say, by the way, it might say that on sidewalk drones, there might be a specific loudness of an auditory signal for people who are blind. It might say there's a specific brightness of lights that are warning lights and so on. So we will get into some specifications about physical things, but that has to do with humans, that humans can hear and see and be warned. It does not talk about the vehicle finding its way to a place. So I hope that distinction is clear, because that's a pretty important distinction. Thank you.
Thanks, Bern. Who else is working in this area such that we could be headed toward competing solutions?
Well, I just came off a meeting last night with 3 other groups in the ISO who are working on related things. They're not the same, and in 2 of the 3 cases, this work builds on top of those cases. I do know that there's let me see if I can find that slide. Sorry. Here. So there's people working in parking standards, and I'm already in communication. We are already in communication with APTS, and that standard would be a basis that it would be non-competitive. There was a concern that they would be competitive at first, but it's not competitive because we're using all of their data elements that are applicable to what we're doing, and we're keeping them the same. We're not going to invent anything new. The same with curb coding standards. We thought we had to do those, and there's no way we're going to redo what's already been done. It's a very good job, we think, a very wonderful job that's being done already in that area and so forth. So to my knowledge, there's no one doing what I'm talking about. For sure, when people hear about it, people understand that they've been thinking about this as a problem, but I'm unaware of anyone starting such a standard, and there's none started at ISO for this as well. If anybody knows about a standard that's matching this or equivalent to this, then we should certainly be collaborating. Please let me know. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Bern. Are any energy suppliers engaged? When I think of curb management, I think of smart hubs for charging, etc. Any major utilities engaged?
No. See, I'm glad that somebody asked that. It's missing. You can see that there's. I did make the comment verbally that this is only part of the stakeholders. So people. Oh, you know what? I did talk to one. I just remember now. I talked to one about 5 weeks ago. But the answer right now is none are engaged yet. And the placement of energy sources would be an element. First of all, they get mapped. If you think about curb LR, they'd be mapped into that. We could, so there's an issue. We could say that a vehicle requests a spot, but they actually request a spot that has charging, for example. That's an example of what we would negotiate. And then when that vehicle says, I need a spot with charging, and then we say, okay, here's a spot with charging, and then reserve that for you and so on. But thank you. If whoever asked that question is an energy provider, I would love to have them collaborate with us. Thank you.
Perfect. Local governments may have little control over AVs in order to meet local goals, for example, clean air, congestion, safety, etc. How does this standard interact with local ordinances?
Why can't a local government say that if you're going to operate robots on my streets, they have to be a certain configuration? Why can't a local government do? I'm an advocate for local governments saying, if you're going to run robots on my street, here's what they have to do. They have to be this, they have to comply to this and that standard. They have to be this and that energy. So any local government that doesn't, like it just lets it happen, that's just, in my opinion, is not responsible. Sorry, thank you.
Thanks, Bern. How are you planning to integrate unintended consequences and other impacts that are beyond the curb? For example, providing more curb space for ride hail or e-commerce can get a better use of the curb, but has huge implications for induced demand and additional negative aspects, i.e. congestion.
So that is correct. The understanding that it's the usual thing. If you build it, they'll come. So if you make room for an enormous amount of robotaxis, then you'll probably get an enormous amount of robotaxis there. If you don't want those robotaxis, then don't build that many spots. So we're not saying that you should build the spots or how big they are. We're not specifying that. Those things are all specified by planners. What we're specifying is that the spots you've built, or the sidewalks that you have, or the drones that you're permitting, or the loading zones that you have created or are managing, we're helping in the distribution of the use of those spaces. We don't say what those, how big or how many those spaces should be. I think that there is a separate issue, and this would be NACTO. NACTO would say, balance e-commerce and ride hailing and public space and bicycle space in a certain way. Here's what the balance should be. We're only distributing the use of that balance. We're not stating what the balance should be. It's a very important difference. And that's why we're not competing with anybody, because many people are trying to get what they call complete streets correct. We're not a complete street standard. We are using complete streets, but that comes in through the mapping. I hope that's a thorough answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Bern. I have another straightforward question here. When do you see the standards process beginning with a working team?
Well, it started, but the working team is just us right now. We have a postdoc that's joining us in about, we're expecting to join us in about 2 weeks. Her expertise is in the accessibility area, especially in aging. So there's a whole issue of seniors using all this automation nonsense on the, I shouldn't say nonsense, but all this automation complexity on our curb and on our sidewalk, and how will seniors cope with all this technology. So she is an expert in that area, and also bringing in communications with the Canadian Institute of the Blind, we hope, and other accessibility institutions that she will be bringing in. So the answer is we're starting now. We've already started some of the draft work, and that's being the early stuff is being presented next Tuesday to ISO for its initial launch. So starting now.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, and we're looking to build that team up very quickly. Who or what type of authority do you imagine can overlook this air traffic control operations?
You mean as an oversight? Sorry, so I don't know the answer. I know, I don't want to say the names of companies, but there's already one of the super duper big cloud companies already seeing that not only is it an important standard for all the reasons that we're talking about here, but the implication is that they see themselves building a system, and they put us on the moon, so they're big enough to build a system. We're not building this system. Our company is only working on the standard. Anyway, so the answer is it would be a very big company. I think one of my concerns is, I'll put it out here, if somebody that's independent of these drones and logistics, and if somebody independent, in other words, if it's not a company independent of these, it's a risk. So in other words, Amazon could do this. They're big enough and smart enough to do this. I'm a little concerned about that company doing it just because they have a particular e-commerce bias. I'd rather see it being done by an organization that is independent of any of these monetization interests. It should be someone who's not monetizing the curb. Sorry, that's a roundabout answer, but it's got to be a big organization to do that.
Yeah, and I have another question, Bern, that is kind of around the same topic. Must there be a single curbside management system, or can multiple curbside management systems coexist?
Okay, there's going to be multiple applications. This is just my vision. So there might be an application that is used by, I'm just going to pick imagine a ride hailing company. You can put the common name there if you want, but a ride hailing company develops an app to query the cloud because I want to land one of my robotaxis on that block. And so that company would write an app, their own app, for their own purposes. And it would simply be negotiating with the cloud for a space and for its reservation and for its being bumped and put on hold and all that stuff. However, there needs to be an underlying common system in the same sense that the Google search engine is sorry to pick a name of a company, but the Google search engine is an underlying search engine for so many, many things. It's kind of like the PC is, in a sense, lands on top of DOS. So there has to be an underlying system that's in common. The reason that at least the underlying system is in common is because if you're moving, let's say you're moving a robotaxi from one system to another, then you have to negotiate your terminus point to pick up a passenger, and then you have to negotiate with someone else to negotiate your drop-off terminus. That's going to become a mess. So you need the reservation system to be in common. It's kind of like the airline industry has what's it called? I forget the name of it, but anyway, there's a single system that manages all that. So it's a single uniform system. Now you might not have it. You might have only one in North America. You don't have to have the same one in Europe, but you're not going to have, like I'm in the Greater Hamilton, Toronto area. You're not going to have 30 different ones for the 30 different cities in Toronto, Hamilton area. It would be unworkable. I'd like to carry that conversation further with the person that asked. It's a very important issue. But thank you.
Perfect. And we will have a list of all the questions and who asked them. We'll follow up directly. I'm just recognizing that we've gone over a couple of minutes. We committed to being done by 2:45. It's now 2:47. Bern and I have a little bit more time, and there are still a couple more questions here. So we'll continue to go through them. For those of you who need to drop off, thank you so much for joining us. And we will be sharing a recorded version of this webinar when it becomes available. And so thanks everyone. And for those of you who want to stick around, I'll continue to go through these questions. So Bern, I'm going to go down to the next question that I have. For kerb recommendations to be flexible, communication to the public is key. Is there a plan to develop standards on how to provide information that is flexible, like digital boards?
Again, I haven't thought about that, but this is an example of an application. Those boards are an application. It's not an app on a cell phone. It could be an app on a cell phone. But those apps and those devices and those displays would be decided locally or decided by planners or decided by developers or decided by the people that revamp the, what do you call them, the complete streets, for example. And those displays on street or on a smartphone would be populated by the data from the server that we're standardizing. It would not be stated in the standard that there must be such devices, but there would be 100%, there will be people that use this data to inform the public. Well, first of all, it has to be the case because at first, there's only a small percentage of vehicles automated. So most of the vehicles are non-automated, and the drivers of those vehicles have to have this information in order not to, for example, park in a spot that has been reserved for a robotaxi that's coming there 3 minutes later. So that information is required, except that we're not specifying what the signage looks like, and we're not specifying what the app looks like. Thank you.
Got it. And right now, that was my last question that I have in the list. If anybody has any other questions, you can raise your hand or type them in. And if I don't see anything come in the next 30 seconds or so, we will end the broadcast. Any closing remarks that you'd like to share, Byrne?
Thank you very much for everyone. I love the interest in this, and we get such good questions every time. That's why we repeat these, because we learn a lot more on each of these calls. So we're doing another in a week, and I hope to learn as much on that one as I have on this one. Thank you to everybody.
So I do have a question. Another
Sure.
one, the last minute throw the question is, what kind of mechanisms would need to be in place to manage the non-automated vehicle implications, i.e. The rest of drivers on the road, that may try to use the same reserved areas that the automated vehicles and drones, etc., would be trying to reserve electronically? How do you see this being enforced, and by who?
Yeah, very difficult issue. So first of all, I said in the previous answer, there has to be signage of some sort. Now, human drivers don't always pay attention to signage, and we all know that. And so that's where the enforcement question comes in. So signage and apps, because I might leave somewhere, this is 5 years from now, and I have an automated vehicle, and I want my automated vehicle to park there, and it's my own private vehicle, and I would have an app that gets a place for me. Well, that's a person who's collaborating with the standard. But then my neighbor just has his car, and he just goes and parks, and he doesn't bother with the signs because he doesn't like parking signs, and he just parks somewhere. There still needs to be enforcement. There still needs to be enforcement of some sort. Now, one of the things that's possible, and it's possible to have sensors that detect that the spot is full, and here's where the uniform system says there's a vehicle in that spot. I don't know what it is. It's not one of the ones we've reserved, so it must be rogue, and it calls in enforcement. Those systems have been around for a decade that detect and call enforcement to clear a spot. I expect that those will have to be used, unfortunately, because there's humans making human decisions that are not cooperative with such a system. And that's going to go on for probably for 10 or 20 years before there are no more human operated vehicles or large areas that do not allow human operated vehicles. That's a long way away. I'm not even predicting when that's going to happen. It's far away. So that's a very important issue in the interim. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, Byrne, we've gotten to the bottom of the list of questions. Congratulations, and thank you to everybody for joining and sticking around with us. We're going to officially close the webinar in the next minute, and we, as I said, we'll share a link to a recorded version. And if you have any questions, you can see Byrne's email address is on the screen right now. And of course, everybody on the call has the ability to reach out to me through email as well. I think at that point in time, I think it's time to say thank you, and we'll look forward to collaborating with you all in the future. Thank you.